What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G.S. Matthews, break down all the original content you watch on the WWE Network and on Peacock and on Vice TV. As today we're talking Season 1, Episode 5 of Tales from the Territories, entitled Stampede, the Hart of Pro Wrestling. This episode featuring Abdullah the Butcher, No Class Bobby Bass, Dr. D. David Schultz, and of course, Bret Hart, talking all about his father's promotion, Stu Hart's promotion, Stampede Wrestling, running Calgary. Bret talks about how Abdullah helped Stampede actually sell out a lot of shows when Abdullah was there. Schultz loved living in Calgary, said he actually wanted to move there, but they wanted no part of that, so I guess they wouldn't accept him as a citizen, he said, or whatever. And it was cool seeing this collection of talent on this episode. Bret was obviously... I don't know what other episodes he was on. I know he was, interviewed, I'm sure, for the Montreal Screwjob episode of Dark Side of the Ring back in Season 1 years ago. Dr. D. David Schultz was on that episode of Dark Side of the Ring on himself and John Stossel when he slapped him. The slap heard around the world, or whatever that episode was, I think back in Season 2 as well. And then Abdullah the Butcher, I think he was on the episode about Brody. I'm pretty sure. Back in Season 1. I could be wrong. I think he was there when he got killed with the Bruiser Brody episode, that is. So I think he was on that episode. So I don't think Bobby Bass has ever been on an episode of Dark Side of the Ring, but a lot of Dark Side of the Ring alumni here on the Stampede edition of Tales from the Territory. So anyway, Bass talks about how he got his nickname, No Class Bobby Bass, from Ed Whalen, one of the announcers at Stampede, for tossing a midget into the lights during one of his matches or whatever. Bret talks about how Stu would put amateur wrestling coaches in a hold for calling pro wrestling fake. And that was really what, convinced them, all right, maybe it's not so fake after all, because they would get fucking stretched to shit by Stu Hart. Bret remembers his friends coming over the house, and they would hear screams from the basement. He was terrified. He could hear screams from the basement, that being the Hart dungeon. He would go down there to do laundry, and he would see Stu put... Jim the Anvil Neidhart in a hold, and he would come down a couple hours later to get said laundry, and he would still be in the same hold, Anvil that is, that he was a couple of hours earlier at the hands of Stu. So they did not take that shit lightly at all. They would, Stu would really train these people for the better, stretch the shit out of them. It was definitely aggressive and intense and whatnot. So Abdullah talks about how Stu actually kept all of his money in his safe down there, would never put money in the bank, and he was always really good with his money and paying talent and stuff like that. Schultz denied going down there for years, never wanted any part of that, and I think he ended up... he told this story about how Schultz was going to be put in a hold by Stu, and he was like, I gotta go, why don't you try it on my wife, and he left. And his wife came up to him later and said, if you ever, I swear to God, don't you ever put me in the same room next to Stu Hart again. Because he put the hold on Schultz's wife. I guess Stu didn't give a shit. He didn't discriminate by gender, so he did it on Schultz's wife. I'm surprised he didn't say that she tried to divorce him after that. I wouldn't be shocked. So they talk about how... Abdullah mentioned the whole safe thing, and then he jokes that he still owed a check from Stu, and it seems like he's taking it seriously here, but he mentions it later and he's kind of joking about it. But he mentioned that he never got his last check from Stu, and Bret Hart said he's going to check the Stu household, the Hart house, for that. And they mention how everyone loves Stu despite never meeting him. A lot of people who never met him love Stu, really helped change and impact the business in a positive way. Bret recalls Stu, his father, stretching someone who tried to steal Stu's car. There was snow on the ground, and whoever tried to steal the car couldn't get the car out of the driveway. So Bret sees Stu, not wrestling, but kind of roughing someone up in the driveway, and then can hear him roughing someone up downstairs on the kitchen table, because you can hear pots and pans clanging and banging and whatever. He does a body count, and he sees all of his brothers upstairs, and he's like, all right, so he's not roughing up my brother, what's going on here? Come to find out, someone tried to steal Stu's car, and it was some kid apparently, and Stu was teaching him a lesson physically. The cops were called, but ultimately what he did, and Bret said this was one of his most fondest memories of his father, was that he wanted to set the kid straight. So I don't think he actually called the cops. I think he called the kid's parents instead. They came to pick him up, but instead of calling the police or having him arrested, he actually gave the kid a job as an usher at Stampede. So he kind of wanted to put him on the right path, which I thought was really cool. Bret recalls this story about picking up Andre from the airport, both him and his brother Smith. That was his... I didn't know there was a Smith Hart. I don't think I've ever heard of him before, but it was Bret and his brother Smith picking up Andre, not from the airport, but they had to bring him to the airport, so they picked him up at his hotel, house, whatever. And Smith was late, so he sped to the airport. Bret said he was going at least 100, maybe it just felt like 100, who knows if that's actually how fast he was going, 100, 120, whatever. The cops obviously chased them, because you can't be doing that shit no matter how late you are. You can get someone killed by driving that fast. They get to the airport. Smith runs Andre into the airport to get him on the flight in time. Bret stays in the car thinking, maybe if I just, play the guilty card here, that he had nothing to do with it, and he didn't, then maybe, you can't just leave the car unoccupied or whatever. So a cop comes up with a gun in his hand, pulled on Bret. And Bret's like, listen, here's what happened, and he was late, I didn't drive it, blah, blah, blah. Smith comes back out of the airport with Andre, and Andre is fuming. You can almost see the steam coming out of his ears. And he was really fucking mad that he missed this flight. And this was a really important show that he had to make, a really important match, whatever. That's why they were driving so quickly. Smith knew that, Bret knew that, Andre knew that, and Andre was getting, he was like groaning in the back seat on their way there because they almost fucking tipped over at one point, which is really scary. They almost flipped over on a quick turn. So they explained this all to the cop, and the cop actually let Smith off. Smith had his hands ready to be handcuffed and taken away to jail. And the cop said, listen, if I even see you jaywalking, there's going to be hell. But I'll let you off here because I understand your story. I don't know if that would happen today or if your father wasn't a famous promoter in the area. It seems like with a lot of these stories, the cops let them off with a slap on the wrist. But anyway, so Andre, on the other hand, was not happy. I mean, he didn't care if Smith got arrested or not. Andre missed his flight. He missed the show. And Bret says he never spoke to Smith again after that. He never spoke to Bret again after that. And he had nothing to do with it. And he never spoke to Stu again after that. And Stu never really understood why Andre was so pissed. He never really got why he was so, upset over the fact that he missed his flight and why Smith was late, blah, blah, blah. Could never really see it from Andre's point of view. And Bret did say that although Andre, never, when he would see him in Atlanta and stuff like that, he would never shake his hand. He would never talk to him. He could hold grudges. He never forgot stuff. But they did eventually become friends in WWE before Andre passed away years later. Abdullah talks about how he had to pretend like he couldn't read or speak English because that was just his character. He had to keep kayfabe at all times. He was out ordering somewhere and he had to pretend like he couldn't read the menu. And the waitress was like, listen, Abdullah, I'll keep it a secret between you and myself, but I know that you can talk. I'll just let you know right now. I know you can talk, so you don't have to play dumb with me. Schultz says that he was threatened one time to have his daughter kidnapped by people who just didn't like him, like fans and stuff like that. Like we heard about this in other episodes of Tales from the Territories about how real fans and how seriously fans would take this shit. And someone threatened to kidnap his daughter. Someone lit his car on fire. I think that actually happened. He recalls an incident where he was going back to his car, a lot like with the Memphis episode with Jerry Lawler, and he sees this guy with like a rock or a boulder in his hand about to smash Schultz's windshield. And Schultz takes a fucking hockey stick from his own car, someone else's car, whatever, and smacks this guy right across the face. Blood goes everywhere. His brother, not Schultz's brother, the other guy's brother, gets out of the car and says, hey, you can't do that, it's my brother. And then Schultz smacks him in the shins as hard as he can with his hockey stick. And he says he still has that hockey stick today. So you do not fucking mess with this guy's car. You do not mess with Dr. D, David Schultz. He makes that very clear. Bret recalls watching Stu versus Abdullah, like this blood feud during the Stampede days, and watching from ringside as a kid. And he remembers kicking Abdullah at ringside. He was lucky that Abdullah didn't kick the shit out of him. Abdullah probably saw, I don't know if he knew that Bret was Stu's kid or not, but he saw that it was a kid. Maybe Stu told him to take it easy, that's his son. But Bret made the dumb mistake of kicking Abdullah, having footprints on Abdullah's back during this match. That's how hard he kicked him. You could see the footprints from Bret on Abdullah's back on his gear. And Abdullah let him off that night, but he realizes how lucky he got in not getting the shit kicked out of him by Abdullah, because that's, again, how seriously they took this shit back in the day. He said that he was very scared of Archie the Stomper Goldie growing up, one of their top heels in that promotion for many years, because that was back when he thought wrestling was still real, and no one would tell him otherwise. He kind of started to figure out that it wasn't real when Goldie, I think, broke Stu's arm on one of the Stampede shows, and he had his arm in a cast at home. He would take the cast off and only put it on when other people came over. Goldie actually came over to pick up a check, And Brett's mom was nice to Goldie through the door. And Brett was very upset that his mom would even be nice to someone who broke his father's hand. And it was around the time that he saw the cast on the table, only putting it on when other people came over, that he started to figure it out, okay, this isn't probably, this wrestling thing probably isn't real. But he would believe all over again every time he went to a show. So he still had that magic as a kid. Schultz remembers leaving his coffee unattended for a very brief period of time and having acid put in his coffee by someone else. Obviously not knowing about it until like 20 minutes later. So he was just beside himself. He couldn't believe it. And he's like, listen, and someone asked him, like, oh, like, what are your thoughts on it? Like, really wanted to get to him because those were just the ribs that people played on each other back in the day. He was like, all right, I'm thinking to himself, he's thinking to himself at this point, I'm going to get back at these people. I'm going to get back at them at some point. So he decides to go home. His wife made cookies. He puts a lax or X-Lax or E-Lax or whatever you want to call it, and horse laxative in his wife's cookies. So basically shit to make you shit. That's what he put in his wife's cookies to bring to the boys. And the boys could not get out the toilet. He thought the initial laxative wasn't strong enough, so he put horse laxative in there as well, and they just would not get out the toilet. Some of the boys wanted to go to the hospital. It was pretty fucking gross. Not as gross as the poop in a bag story from a few episodes ago. That was gross. I think that was last week with Mad Dog with Sean putting his head in the bag. I won't repeat it here, but it was pretty fucking disgusting. Brett was one of the people that was ribbed. I don't know if he was in on the initial rib, but he had some of those cookies, and he thought for the longest time, he thought it was the hot dogs, and he has not had a hot dog since. So he comes to find out on this episode, it was Schultz and Schultz's cookies, which is just tremendous. They talk about how Calgary was famous for Mabel parties, and how this red-headed woman would, throw parties with the wrestlers, and I guess Mark's fans, they say, would be there as well. And so they would be there as well. This woman had a husband that wasn't there, and she would flirt with the wrestlers when, her husband wasn't home. Her husband came home one time, and he had a gun, except it was one giant rib, and he would start shooting blanks at some of the wrestlers. The wrestlers that were in on it would have ketchup in their shirts and act and sell as if they were just shot by this crazy, angry husband. So these people would run off, the people that weren't in on it, fucking terrified, calling the police. The police would come over and drink beer with the wrestlers because they also would be in on it. They were aware of it. And that's a pretty good rib. I mean, that's pretty serious shit, but that is very well done. They almost a little too well done, Brett says. I thought that was funny. They would all recall the snowstorms that they would get in Calgary and having to really drive very carefully. You couldn't even see the road most times, and when a truck would go by, getting snow all over the fucking car, you would just take your hands off the wheel, because steering would make it worse. Steering would make it worse, so they would just have to be real careful, go slow, all that other sort of stuff. They would have to burn things, Bass said, to keep warm in the car. Brett remembers one time the bus breaking down that would transport all the wrestlers from one show to another in Calgary. An old couple stopped to help them, and as soon as they saw all the wrestlers piling out of the van, or the bus or whatever, they sped off immediately. They wanted no part of it. A few people did end up stopping and helping get the wrestlers to the show, and they would do it by match. So like if you were in match 1, they would bring those people first to the show, someone else would come by, match 2, so on and so forth. It gave them enough time to fix the bus, so I thought that was pretty cool. From there, they talk about Bad News Allen, and this was really when the territory started to go downhill. He got suspended for using a fork on his opponents, and he got big over in Japan, and he mentioned that he was big over in Japan because he wouldn't really sell much for his opponents, and everyone on this panel agreed that's not how you do business here in the States. That's not what works here. This is not Japan. Giving your opponents nothing is not going to get the other person over, or anyone really over. You can't go into business for yourself. So Brett talks about how Allen would turn on Goldie, the stomper guy, the hated villain from earlier in the episode that he talked about. He was towards the end of his career at this point. He had been a hated heel for so long, they wanted to turn him babyface. So Goldie had a son on the show, not his real son, but they were going to use Allen and have him turn on Goldie and Goldie's son, specifically Goldie's son, to put sympathy on Goldie and make him this fan favorite. And Allen, before the angle, asked about using the fork. He was denied, and he used it anyway. He didn't give a shit. So he used the fork on Goldie or Goldie's son during the angle. He actually, while he was walking to the back, if that wasn't bad enough, Brett saw this and thought, well, he's getting suspended. So that sucks. And if that wasn't bad enough, he actually pulled up a 90-year-old fan who I guess smacked Allen on the back of the leg. I mean, how hard? The guy's fucking 90 years old, but he must have touched his leg or whatever on the way back up the ramp. Allen pulls this 90-year-old guy, and they knew he was old because he was a really long-time fan, had gone to all the shows, stuff like that, by his hair. And he was floating basically above the chair by his hair by Bad News Allen. And they knew at that point, well, this is not good. Ed Whalen, who gave Bass his nickname, as they mentioned earlier in the episode, he was so upset with the whole thing, he actually quit as soon as that show was over. They knew this whole angle would do big business for them that winter, and it went over strong that night. Goldie Sr., not the son, cut this great promo, and the crowd acted as if someone died, and then the son got stretchered out of the arena. Great angle, but from a behind-the-scenes standpoint, they were in a lot of shit. Allen had just gotten suspended from that part of the territory in Calgary or wherever. I guess it went town by town. The commission would not allow them to use forks and stuff, so he used the fork, he got in trouble, and he got suspended from that town. And then Ed Whalen was so unhappy with the whole thing, like I said, he quit as soon as the show was over. The next thing happened, or the exact same thing happened the next night when they were in, I think it was Edmonton, actually. Allen, again, used the fork, and he attacked a fan with a chair that did the same thing. Must have hit him in the back of the leg while he was walking back up the ramp to the back, whatever. And he attacked the fan with a fucking chair. So it was so serious that Stu lost his license in Edmonton. Allen suspended there as well. It basically killed the territory. The feud was off. They had to turn fans away from the arena. Couldn't do shows for a little while. It was all downhill from there. Bret Hart mentioned that Stu had to sell everything to Vince the following August, because all this happened in 1983. The following August in 1984, he had to sell the promotion to Vince. Vince apparently, I guess junior, maybe it was senior. I assume it was junior because WrestleMania was the following year. I think senior had already passed away at that point. I don't remember exactly. I'm sure they were talking about Vince Jr. He never paid Stu a dime for Stampede Wrestling. And because of that, they got Stampede back, but it wasn't the same. And they ended up closing up for good in December of 1989. To wind it down here, Bret talks about Stampede's legacy, said it was worth it to do this episode and to talk about it, to see all the boys, and mentioning how, is a wrestler's life really worth it as far as taking all the bumps and broken bones and being away from your family. For him, he says it was worth it to have spent time with the boys and spend time with them here on this episode, kind of reminiscing on the memories of Stampede along with Schultz and Abdullah and Bass. And the rest of the boys joke, hey, Bret, if you want to start up Stampede again, I'm serious. Specifically Abdullah, he was really high on the idea of Bret doing Stampede again and wanted to be a part of it. Probably so he can get his check. And he mentioned on that same note, he mentions, hey, Bret, I was kidding. Just so everyone's watching and listening and witnessing this. Just to let you know from earlier, talking about the check, I was just kidding. No big deal. Then he says behind his hand, I'll take cash instead of a check. So I thought that was funny. Good stuff here. I thought this was very enjoyable, along the same lines as the other episodes on the show so far, Tales from the Territories. Very good stuff. I mean, I like learning about all this stuff because I'm not really well-versed in the territory days of wrestling before WWF and WWE and whatnot, and WCW and stuff like that. So this is all new information to me. I don't really know a lot of these stories. Probably 90% of these stories I've never heard before. So I thought it was a great idea for a show that's exceeded my expectations so far. I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, but you still have the, reenactments. You got a panel of notable names, and some really good stories to boot that really carry the show. So I thought it was a good episode again from Tales from the Territory. Stampede, the Hart of Pro Wrestling. I think next week is on Polynesian Wrestling. I think Kevin Sullivan's on that panel and a few other people. I know I saw Kevin Sullivan along with a few other people, but I forgot who they were. That will be coming up on Tuesday, so I'm officially caught up. This was the most recent episode this past Tuesday on Vice. The next one airs on Tuesday this coming week. I think they did 8 episodes this season, or this half of the season, I don't remember. So I think Tales from the Territories wraps up in 2 weeks. We got 3 episodes left, including the one coming up on Tuesday. My review of that should be up either later this coming week or next Monday, next weekend, not exactly sure yet, but keep an eye out for that. Have an awesome one, guys. I'm Graham GSM Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.